Hi everyone, welcome. I can see that we have a number of people joining, so we're going to wait just a few minutes and give everyone a chance to log in. For those of you that have joined, I'm just going to launch a poll just so we can see everyone's level of understanding and how much support you already have in place. If you get a second and would like to fill that out for us. Perfect. And I know that some of you were expecting to see Celine here today, but unfortunately she's had to take some time out for personal reasons. I'll introduce myself properly in a minute or two, but my name's Holly Rowland and I'm Head of Clinical Services at Fatifa. I can see lots of you are already filling out that poll for us, so that's great.
I just tried and it won't let me.
Oh. I'm sorry. Perfect. Let's give it a minute or two more and then we'll get started. Lovely. I'm getting some really good information from that poll there, and I'll go through that in a minute. Perfect. Again, for anyone that's just joined, I know you're expecting to see Celine here today, but my name's Holly and I'm just standing in for Celine today. She's had to take some personal time today. Perfect. So it looks like we've got a really good number here, so I think we're good to get started, if that's okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We're focusing on how to write a pregnancy loss policy for your workplace. We're delighted that you're able to join us today, and we hope that by the end of the session you feel equipped with the tools to build a framework and provides clarity and support for, in a way that truly meets your team's needs. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points, as always, with these webinars. So just to note that the webinar is being recorded. And that recording will be shared with you afterwards. Everything in the chat can be seen by other webinar attendees, but if you'd like to participate anonymously in the Q&A section, please remember to tick the anonymous box and obviously don't share any identifiable information. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, but do feel free to submit them as they come to you. As I mentioned already, I'm sure many of you were expecting to see Celine here today, but she's had to take some time away for personal reasons. So my name is Holly Rowland, and I'm your Fatifa host for today. I'm the Head of Clinical Services here at Fatifa, and today's topic is one that is close to my heart, both professionally and personally. I've spent the last 10 years as a midwife and fertility nurse, and that's given me the privilege of supporting families through some of the most intense and challenging experiences of their lives. And over the years, I've experienced the spectrum of pregnancy loss, including couples whose baby has perhaps died late in pregnancy, terminations for medical reasons, miscarriages, ectopics. But this list is by no means exhaustive, and that list could go on and on. But beyond that, I have my own story, which is a personal experience, and it will always shape the way that I work. But I think I have a very unique perspective in that these I've seen sort of both sides to those experiences, and I understand the emotional impact that baby loss can have, not only on individuals directly affected, but also those that support them as well, whether that's in a personal relationship or in a professional capacity, much like professionals in HR that will come across that in their work life as well. If you're new to Fatifa, we are Europe's most comprehensive reproductive health and neurodiversity benefits provider, and we help employers like Meta, Sony, and Lululemon support their employees throughout their entire reproductive health journey, whether it's fertility, family forming, menopause, or men's health. We're here to help create more inclusive places, which is exactly what today's webinar is about, supporting your employees through pregnancy loss and by creating a policy that is fit for purpose and that is practical and inclusive. And to help us on this topic today, we're delighted to be joined by Natalie Sutherland. Natalie, would you be happy to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So, I'm Natalie. I'm a family law solicitor. I deal with all aspects of family law, but I have a particular specialism in fertility law and surrogacy. And I'm a partner at Burgess Me. But I'm also a podcast host. I have my own podcast, Infertility in the City, where I speak with lots of people who tell me about how their fertility challenges has impacted on their professional life. And we cover a lot in relation to baby loss.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Um, so just to go back to the poll that we launched at the beginning. So it's really interesting to see that 24% of you, sorry, already have a pregnancy loss policy in place, which is really great news. But it also leads us on to the first of our topics, which is oops, sorry, let me close that down. Which is different types of pregnancy loss, how it can affect someone emotionally and physically, and the impact it can have on them at work. So I thought I would start by going through the different types of pregnancy loss and how it can, uh, and sort of the different definitions with that as well. And Natalie, I will come and ask for your input on this as well, if that's okay. So I think when we talk about pregnancy loss, I think our minds automatically go straight to things like miscarriage, which is the unexpected end of a pregnancy before 23 weeks and 6 days, which is a very specific cutoff. That's where Natalie can perhaps have more input in a minute. And this can be sort of further defined as early miscarriage, which are those that happen before 12 weeks of pregnancy, and late miscarriage, which happen after 12 weeks of pregnancy. A pregnancy loss where the baby dies after 24 weeks of pregnancy is then called a stillbirth. Um, there are situations where the embryo can implant outside of the uterus, which is called ectopic pregnancy, and these can be life-threatening if not managed appropriately or in a timely manner as well. When an embryo implants but stops developing very early in the pregnancy, and we refer to that as a biochemical pregnancy as well. We also have molar pregnancies, which are maybe a little bit more uncommon, not quite heard of as frequently. And this is where cells of the pregnancy develop abnormally due to there being too much or too little genetic material. These pregnancies can go on to, they unfortunately don't go on to a normal, healthy pregnancy, and can lead to some quite serious complications where almost always surgery is required to remove that pregnancy from the uterus, and there can be a risk of that going on to cause a cancer as well. So really quite serious, and it's not very well known at all. Each of these, that list, I could go on explaining lots and lots of different types of pregnancy loss, and there will always be situations that come up that perhaps you're not sure about, or something that you've not come across before or don't feel confident about. And that's where really you can rely on people like Fatifa and our clinical expertise to kind of guide you on that personally as well. And we're always happy to sort of provide support with that. With each of these scenarios, the symptoms and the presentation is very different for everybody. Sometimes these things may be identified during a routine appointment or ultrasound or scan. So often situations where patients are not expecting to have that news, and can be quite sudden and quite shocking information as well. Sometimes there can be symptoms in the lead up to having a diagnosis where perhaps someone is experiencing a bit of spotting or bleeding, or just has like a feeling. Sometimes there's a lot to be said for general intuition and your gut instinct, and sometimes that can be the only indication that somebody has. Um, the follow-up for each of these can be very different as well. Sometimes surgery is required, sometimes medication, sometimes there is just a watch and wait and see what happens. And that can be quite challenging to manage, because you just don't know when someone is going to need that extra support or a visit to the hospital or the GP. But in many cases, medical care and sick leave will be necessary. Natalie, I think you've been very open about your own experiences of pregnancy loss, and obviously you have lots of experience with that in your role and your career as well. I wondered if you'd be happy to sort of share some of those experiences.
Yeah, no problem. So what you were saying there about having an intuition, I kind of felt that, but I was in complete denial. So this is with my second pregnancy. So I already had an 18-month, no, 2-year-old daughter. And we got pregnant in the February naturally, very, very excited about it. And then within about 6 weeks, I had some spotting, which I'd never had in my first pregnancy at all. But on this time, I did actually experience pregnancy symptoms. So I had morning sickness and, my boobs were hurting and, all that stuff. I was getting cravings and everything, but this was, which I didn't have with my first pregnancy. So I kind of was like loving it. I was like, I am now getting the full pregnancy experience and I was very happy about it. But with that spotting, I was very, very scared. And I went to the EPU, the early pregnancy unit, and was basically sent away. They sort of did a physical exam. I hadn't been bleeding that much. They said we wouldn't see anything on the scan anyway, because I think 6 or 7 weeks, whatever I was too soon. And I was later I was told that was not true. I mean, I don't know if that's right, but if I'd had a scan, they may have been able to tell me there and then that I'd lost the baby. But instead, I didn't have a scan, and I went away, bleeding stopped, continued having pregnancy symptoms, and was really just hoping that I was still pregnant. But as we were like really close then to the 12-week scan, and I just felt different. I felt like my boobs weren't hurting anymore. And I just suddenly just didn't feel pregnant anymore. And I couldn't explain it. But I was like, you know, but no, I have been. So let's just, go to the scan anyway. I went to my 12-week scan, and they were asking me, are you sure about your dates? Are you sure? Because obviously I was expecting, and they were expecting to see a 12-week-old baby in the size of it. And of course there was nothing there. So what had happened is I'd stopped, like the baby would have died at 6 weeks, but I had a sac that was 12 weeks the size it should have been. So that's what we call a missed miscarriage. So my body continued thinking it was pregnant, which is why I was still having my symptoms. But there was no baby. And I was just devastated. And I think about it now, that poor sonographer who had to deliver that news and then obviously bring in the doctor for the second opinion and to tell me. And then they usher you off into a room trying to avoid the other pregnant ladies that are waiting for their 12-week scan. And then they give you some leaflets and give you your options, which is expectant management. So just watch and wait. You'll pass the product at some point and get your period. Medical management, which is you take the pill. There's a tablet to take, and then you should be able to pass it. But that's with the hospital, or surgical management. So where you go in for your, is it called an ERPC, I think. So
Yes.
yeah, so is that right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So I opted for expectant management because as these things happen, my nan died, so I had to go for her funeral in Wales, and I just didn't want to deal with it. And I kept showing that I was still pregnant, like with the pregnancy test, they kept, telling you to test. And then I was just really distressed about it. So I said, well, let's just do the tablets. So I did that. I had to stay in hospital overnight, incredibly painful. I couldn't do the D&C because I have fibroids and they didn't want to mess around with that. Eventually, I had to have surgical management. So so I was general anaesthetic to get rid of all of the products of conception, as they call it. So that would have been in April, May. It was beginning of May when I had the surgery. I continued to test positive. So it wasn't like it was ending there. So I kept going to having scans. They were like, we can't see anything, but I was still testing positive pregnancy. They said you'll get your period eventually, and I did. I got my period in the August. By this time, I'd left where I was living. I've moved somewhere else, and still dealing with the sort of aftershocks of that. But then I experienced what I consider to be miscarriage related symptoms. I was eventually diagnosed as uh what was it? Abnormal uterine bleeding, dysfunctional uterine bleeding, sorry. And I can only describe it, and sorry for being, a bit gross, but like whooshing a whooshing of blood coming out of me completely unexpectedly, more blood than I've ever seen in my life, and it just wasn't stopping. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, so then I was like, well, this must now be the end of my miscarriage. This must be the end of it. So that was in September. By October, I was rushed to hospital because of so much bleeding. I had it a few times. I knocked myself out, so I fainted and smacked my head on the sink, and yeah, so horrible, horrible time, but no, with no idea that could last that long. That miscarriage symptoms and related gynae problems would ensue. So. So yeah, so then I had to go to hospital and have life-saving treatment. They put the coil in as the only way to try and stop the bleeding. It was either that or a hysterectomy. And I was 39 at the time, really wanted to try for another baby, didn't want a hysterectomy, had to sign the form to let them do the hysterectomy if that was the only thing to save my life. But when I came to, the anaesthetist said, you still have your womb. The coil stopped the bleeding, which apparently the gynecologist told my mother that she didn't expect to happen.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I was apparently quite close to for them losing me, but they managed to get me in and save my life and stop the bleeding. So then I had to deal with a coil being in and couldn't get pregnant, and so that was in for a year. And when it came out, the bleeding didn't start again, thank God. But I've not been able to get pregnant since. So there was kind of like a secondary infertility that followed after that. Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, I think thank you for being so sort of honest and candid with your story. I think it really helps sort of have insight like that when
All the heart.
I know it's lovely.
How do I
Um,
do that?
it's so helpful to someone that perhaps hasn't what very fortunately hasn't had to go through something like that,
Mm,
to kind of really get an insight. I think it's often portrayed that you perhaps go for a scan, you perhaps get some you get some awful news at that scan, and often it's sort of dealt with there and then, and that's very much not the case in real life.
mm,
You often are sent away with leaflets and you have to make that decision on your own. You call up the gynae ward and say, "Yep, I've made my decision and this is how I want to proceed." And there's lots and lots of onus on an individual in that situation to kind of, I guess, in a way, plan their own care for that.
mm.
And that's a huge that takes a huge psychological
Oh God, yeah.
toll on someone.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't have necessarily have the background or knowledge to kind of decide what's best for you, and that can be really tricky. And I think often that's where the additional support is required, where perhaps you do need a couple of days to kind of think about your choices and just
Mm,
absorb that information that you've had. And yeah, I think, yeah, thank you for sharing that, because it's really valuable and I think really helpful in terms of just giving a bit of context to what someone might actually be going through
mm.
when they have a miscarriage, or when they tell you they're going through.
Exactly, exactly. And it happens to so many of us. And a lot of women will try and not hide it, but don't want to talk about it potentially. Especially when you've got this whole don't tell anyone you're pregnant until after 12 weeks rubbish.
Mm.
But I just had a memory then. So just before, so like the day before I went in for that scan, my younger sister, had phoned me to tell me she was pregnant. So I was extremely happy for her, and I thought, oh, pregnant at the same time, how lovely. And she's younger than me, but she's got more kids than me. This is, it's only my second. And but prior to that, she'd had a miscarriage, and I was probably one of those well-meaning but really stupid people that said, "Oh, but you've got other kids. You can get pregnant again," not having any idea what a miscarriage does to you physically, emotionally, completely. All I had was like the what you see on TV, the so that something that happens quickly, that you get over quickly, that it's not really a thing because it's not actually a baby yet. Just
Mhm.
being completely naive and very insensitive to my own sister. So she didn't want to talk to like either me or my other sister about our pregnancies or whatever. She was dealing with it in her own way. But then I had mine and I just fell apart. So, and then I was like, oh my God, Kaylee, I'm very sorry for being that person. But yeah, and that's why even with colleagues, I suppose it's quite easy to fall into that trap of saying, at least you can get pregnant, or you can try again soon, and not validating that this loss is profound. So yeah, as much as my experience was awful, and it still is with me now, and I still sort of get tearful thinking about it, but it's really good to do this, to be able to share stories and make it better for other people.
Absolutely. I think it's also worth sort of just highlighting the fact as well where with the miscarriage. So although the pregnancy has stopped developing at 6 weeks, you were still experiencing symptoms and it felt as though you were still very
Mm,
much pregnant. I know that you said that just before your scan you
just
had
before, yeah.
an inkling, but I think it's worth highlighting that even once a miscarriage has been confirmed or someone has, so not just miscarriage, to say you have an ectopic pregnancy, you can have symptoms for quite some time after a diagnosis has been made
Mm,
as well. So even if you've had treatment to remove products of conception, and I'm sorry if I use any language that is triggering to some people, I'm very sorry. Um, but when someone's had procedures like that, that can go on for quite some time afterwards, and um, particularly in cases like molar pregnancy, where there's more that the cells of the pregnancy are growing much more quickly than they would in a normal pregnancy. Those symptoms that you have in pregnancy, so nausea, breast tenderness, can be much, much, much worse, and it can take a lot longer to then settle back down again as well. So it's not just like an end date to
no.
these situations. It can really go on for some
Mhm.
time. I think as well, things about like anniversaries or due dates or things like that can also be quite triggering sometimes, or be really important dates for certain people. So I think when you're considering like leave in the policy, it's kind of allowing flexibility in that somebody may feel like they need some time off around an expected due date,
Mhm.
to kind of to take some time for themselves at that point as well. Um, the government recently introduced the certificate to acknowledge loss as well.
Mhm.
This isn't a legal requirement, so if someone does experience a pregnancy loss before 24 weeks, they don't have to have a certificate. They wouldn't need to prove that to anybody. It's just there as well for acknowledgement, to acknowledge that there was a baby, there was that child, and I think that's really important to know as well. I think there can often be a bit of confusion around whether that's something that is given automatically, but
Mhm.
I don't know whether that's something that you could explain a bit more, Natalie, or
So, can I just say I received mine today?
oh.
So this is what it looks like. So you can put in the date, you can put in a name, you can put in the place where it happened. Um, so yeah, this I literally just opened it today. Look, so I applied for it 2 weeks ago. So they started the process with so I couldn't apply at that point because my loss was too long ago. So they did that to not crash the system. So people who'd had losses recently were able to apply. So I knew I wanted to apply, and yeah, and then when they opened it up again, I did, and yeah, it's actually it does feel validating. I hadn't actually chosen it. We didn't know the sex, so I don't know if I'd lost a boy or a girl. But also doing the work that I do now, sorry, I'm no one off on a tangent, but so I have a daughter, and she was there when I was bleeding out on the bathroom floor. She's the one who got my phone so I could call my mother and call the ambulance. And she remembered just me being in hospital. But she didn't obviously know what had been happening. And prior to that, we were reading to her books about, how to be a big sister and stuff, and they just got put in the bin. So we didn't do that. But But then when I started talking about this openly, I didn't want her to read about it online. So, or, when she's older or whatever. So I did tell her, what happened, because she kept asking for a sibling. So having to explain to her. And she came up with the name Imogen. So that's what we put on the certificate. So again, like, I don't know if it was a boy or a girl, but that's who we put on there. So, but yeah, so if anybody is thinking about getting a certificate, I think it's a really nice thing. It's not, it's an official acknowledgement. And even the first word of their letter is, "We are sorry for the loss you've experienced, whether the loss was recent or many years ago. We hope this certificate will provide some comfort to you." And they give you a list of lots of charities. So yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah, it's an important piece of work that they've done around that, and I'm so glad that they've done it. I
Yeah.
think it's just going to be life-changing, I think, for some people. Perfect. So I thought we could move on to why a pregnancy loss policy is important, and what should be included in that. So I wondered whether Natalie, you'd be able to explain sort of like some of the legal terminology around sort of the definitions around pregnancy loss,
Mhm.
if you're happy to do that.
Yeah, so well, you've done it already. So you have your basically from 24 weeks. That is when so from the stillbirth. So anything and any miscarriage after 24 weeks is considered a stillbirth, and you would then be entitled to your maternity leave, but essentially it's bereavement leave. And then whatever pay is relevant as well. Prior to that, nothing. So there is a literal cliff edge at that 23 weeks, 6 days. And if you lose at that point, then you're not entitled to anything. So this is why we're looking for employers to put in place their own baby loss policies so that they can do something about it without needing, without the legal requirement. Because it's a good thing. If you lose whenever, so a loss is a loss, and it can be as devastating if it happens really early on, or at that 23-week 6 day point, or after. Doesn't matter when it is, but the law says that you only have that entitlement after the 24 weeks, which is hugely unfair, and I'm working with lots of people to try and change that. But so yeah, so your baby loss policy, as well as defining what baby loss is, should then be set out what you as an employer would are happy for your employees to take whenever they have had their loss. So you're not relying on statutory provisions. You are going over and above to provide that support to your employees that have experienced a devastating loss.
Perfect. And I think we often get asked, well, when we worked on this policy internally, we were talking about how many days someone might need to take as well. And I think the answer to that is it's very different for everybody. And I think we've both sort of explained how that looks. It might be that someone has an ultrasound scan one day, gets some news that they're not, that perhaps indicates that things aren't looking as they should. They may then have to the current NHS guide, the NICE guidance is that if a pregnancy is measuring smaller than it is expected, then a repeat scan is offered 7 to 10 days later. It might be at that point that things are still a little bit ambiguous, and another scan may be offered in a few days' time still. So it is very different. We have in the policy template that we have created, and I'll share that in the chat a bit later on today. We have sort of outlined what we think would work for us as a company at Fatifa, but that is ultimately down to the discretion of the employer. But it's definitely not a one size fits all
No, no.
policy, unfortunately.
Mhm.
um,
And what I would also say to that is, don't worry about trying to be perfect, because look, everyone will experience this differently, and what they need, they may not know what they need until it happens to them, and then they still may not know what they need. But as an employer, acknowledging that this is a significant life event, and it's something that you're prepared to be flexible over and to give a minimum amount. People will then decide to take it up or not. Some people don't want to have that time off. They want to be able to just go to work, forget about it. So they will have different needs from other people. But yeah, so don't worry about being perfect. What you should do though is keep it as a living document, something that you constantly update as and when you have an employee that has experienced something differently and they've asked for something else and you thought that's a good idea, I'll put that in the policy as well, so that other people can benefit from that, so that it's more things that you've thought about, because you may not be able to think about everything. Like I said, I did not know how a miscarriage would impact me until it did. So if I was just putting a policy together with no experience, I'd probably make a hash of it. But taking that experience from your employees, and also audit. I was thinking about this. So if you're thinking of putting a policy together, maybe audit your workforce to see if anybody wants to be able to input into it. Because anyone that's had a miscarriage many years ago, or even just recently, and had an experience that was either beneficial or not beneficial, they might be able to give you those ideas as to what to put into a policy that will then be this, really good document that you as an employer have for your employees.
Absolutely. I think it's also worth including other sources of support on the policy as well. So there are lots and lots of resources out and about, especially there's been lots of work done around that. You've got the Miscarriage Association, Tommy's. Again, I could go on and on with the list of support. And again, we can help provide information there. Again, on the policy template, we have included lots of support as well. Again, that individuals that helped work on the policy have been to for support themselves, and sort of have good experiences of. So really important to include that as well. It's also good to point out as well that it doesn't just affect the pregnant person. There is often a partner. There are maybe surrogates involved. There are a whole host of people that that situation could affect, and I think it's important to consider those people in that policy as well. It may be that you consider adding compassionate leave for partners, or a surrogate that may have to then deal with intended parents as well. I, I think, like Natalie said, it's important to kind of ask for input from your team as well. That I think we all think we know our colleagues and our team members, but there's always sides that we don't see. People do tend to like to keep sort of personal and work lives very separate. So it can be good to sort of a good opportunity to kind of get some insight to those experiences. On that topic, where I've started talking about non-birthing parents and partners, I wondered whether you could sort of outline the different routes to family forming for us.
Yeah. So gosh, so I deal with things like surrogacy. So you may have a same-sex male couple who are undergoing surrogacy in the UK or abroad. You could have a heterosexual couple that are undergoing surrogacy. So your employee may be those intended parents, your employee may be the surrogate. If the surrogate experiences a loss, then obviously she has the physical side of that, but also there's going to be this emotional side where she's likely to feel guilty and even more emotional for her intended parents. So there's just a slight different layer to that, I think, that's worth acknowledging. And then, of course, you have the intended parents that are having to deal with that, who don't have the physical side, but then now have to try again. You could have single women, single men through surrogacy. So single women would be through sperm donation, either at home, so a known donor, or through a clinic, so an anonymous donor. Same-sex female couples who again use a sperm donor outside of a clinic, inside of a clinic. I'm seeing a rise in co-parenting, platonic co-parenting. So that could be a man and a woman who are friends, or even strangers that have just met up to be able to get pregnant and raise a child together, but separately. So no romantic relationship. Child automatically has two homes from the outset. Both legal parents. It could also be a same-sex female couple and a gay man, or a gay couple who decide to co-parent together. Lots of legal implications there, so definitely take advice. Yeah, so, and then obviously your heterosexual couples who need fertility treatment because they're not able to conceive naturally. So a myriad of ways of of how people create their family. I don't think we should forget adoption either. So I was speaking, so on my podcast this week, plug, I'm speaking to Sharara McHugh, and she was telling me that in the US, they have, even though they have horrible parental leave, they actually, in her state anyway, in Illinois, they had leave for a fallen through adoption. And I just thought I've never heard of that before. So, if you're intending to have a child through adoption and it falls through, that will feel like a loss to you, and will be as devastating. Again, not the physical side of things, but just as devastating. One thing I think employers should also consider is a failed embryo transfer. Anyone going through fertility treatment who have that embryo transfer will believe they are pregnant until you're pregnant until proven otherwise. You've seen that embryo inserted in, and for all intents and purposes, you are going to have a baby. And then if that doesn't implant, it's as devastating as a miscarriage. I believe lots of people on my podcast have said the same. So as employers, you may not have thought of that as a baby loss, but certainly thinking about including that as well, so that anyone who's gone through that, looking at the policy, they say that relates to me. So yeah, so it's trying to be as inclusive as possible so that anybody looking at your policy feels included. And again, being receptive to any other family forms that we haven't thought about yet. So thruples, things like that are hot in the news. So yeah, we're trying to figure that out legally.
I think it's really good that you pointed out the effects of sort of embryo transfers that have been unsuccessful as well. So yeah, it's not something I've mentioned before, but that's something I've seen firsthand multiple times in my
Yeah.
career. And you're right, it can be just as devastating for those people. So definitely important to consider. So I guess so the next point really is how we make that policy, make sure the policy is utilized and also accessible. So I wondered if you had any tips on opening up that workplace conversation.
I do. So, so I am my firm's fertility officer. So, pretty much the whole reason I talk about this is because having had my miscarriage, I joined a new firm, and two of my colleagues had come to me to say that, because I was open about it, to say that they believe that they might struggle with their fertility because they've been diagnosed with PCOS. And sadly, they actually both went on to miscarry their first babies, which was devastating for them. But in that time period, I had shared my story with my partners and said, I really want us to have this openness in our firm, so that because we were a firm mainly of young women. We like I say, I'm a family lawyer, and it's predominantly women. And at the time, we had two male partners, but everyone else was female, and young women who were in relationships, getting married, very likely to want to have a family. And it was almost like it was nobody speaking about it. Nobody's talking about the idea that people might want to get pregnant. Well, if you add to that the possibility that people may struggle to get pregnant, then you're adding an extra sort of layer of taboo on top of that, because they don't want to go to their employer to say, I've got fertility issues, outing themselves as wanting a baby if they're worried about that in the first place. So having shared my miscarriage story with my partners, I was really just really lucky that they were very receptive to this idea, and then suggested that I be the firm's women's officer, who would be able to then, so put a person in place, tell the firm that that's what I can help them with, and that to open up that culture so that people aren't worried about disclosing any kind of pregnancy related issues. We changed it to fertility officer because, of course, fertility issues and baby loss, not just a women's issue. It's not all on us. Yeah, so obviously at the time we didn't have any males in there, but to make sure that it was not this just a women's issue. So we increased our maternity and paternity. We put in place a fertility benefits policy, a fertility policy to be able to go have appointments, and then also this baby loss policy as well. So saying about having time off. But to be able to create that open culture, if you have somebody that you advertise to your company as being the person to speak to if they have any fertility, reproductive related issues, that's the person to go to. And it probably helps if they've had their own personal experience in, there's a wide range of experiences as possible. Like I haven't ever had IVF, but I've had baby loss. So having that person who has first-hand experience of it will be beneficial, but it's not necessary because we can all learn. Putting in place training, so putting, telling your employees that you're taking this seriously by putting money into it, by putting resources behind it, so that so you're training everybody, train your juniors, train your managers, and also think about vicarious trauma. So if you're the person dealing with everyone else's fertility issues and you have your own fertility issues, that can be triggering as well. So bearing that in mind as well, you don't want this sort of vicious cycle. But yeah, just having open conversations where people do feel comfortable and safe to share is what it creates this domino effect of well, you've shared yours and nothing happened, nothing bad happened, I can share mine. So that's how we started.
Amazing. That sounds like such an incredible role to have within a company. And again, I think lots of workplaces implement things like fertility champions or
Mm,
loss champions, baby loss champions, whatever works for your company.
yeah,
Again, it's not a one size
yeah.
fits all, and again, that can be a very sort of changeable role depending on the need. Um, I think it's worth mentioning that it can feel quite uncomfortable if you've not necessarily had that experience and listening to somebody else's experience before, especially if you've not got that training. So that's where again you can sort of come to Fatifa. We're happy to do sort of managers training and provide support as well. We know it's tough, and we want the best for your employees. So we are more than happy to provide that support for you as well as them. We often find that we have employees contacting the clinical team after things like IVF. They don't, maybe they're waiting to do a pregnancy test after they've had an embryo transfer. They're feeling anxious. They don't know what's going to happen next. They've gone for a scan and the findings are uncertain. We perhaps have concerns about pregnancy symptoms disappearing, much like you
Mm.
said that you'd found with your own experience. So we are constantly providing that support, and we're very happy to do that. But sometimes it's nice speaking to someone face to face, and that's where
Mhm.
HR support, employer support comes from as well. So
And of
really.
course, it's speaking to that person you're comfortable with, whoever that is in the company. It's a personal experience, and you may not want to tell someone very senior or whatever, but yeah, it's having that person in place means that your employees know that there's someone they can speak to specifically about this issue, not just a general HR issue, but specifically about these, because as women, especially women, we worry about how any kind of time out from the office can impact on our career trajectory, whether that be through baby loss, fertility treatment, or actually having a baby and then taking maternity leave. So we are worried. We're worried about disclosing this information. And if you have a line manager that either, never wanted kids, that doesn't understand what all of this is about, you're going to have some pushback. You're not going to have that understanding and the empathy for, right, I kind of know what you're going through, so I can cut you some slack, I can offer you that flexibility. So you want to avoid that line manager lottery where you're just just saying, well, you just go to your line manager, because we all bring our own fears and prejudices and biases to the office. So you don't want to come up against that really when you're experiencing something that's really profound and you need support. So getting ahead of the problem, because this is something that is happening all the time, sadly. It's, when I shared my story and it was on Instagram, I had so many people that I was friends with for years tell me it happened to them, and I had no idea. So it will be happening to lots of people. So try and avoid that line manager lottery by implementing these policies and having identified people, your point of contact ahead of time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Natalie. Your insights have just been invaluable. Yeah, super helpful. Um, I will share our policy template in the chat, so you're able to download that and have a look at that and use it as much as you want. But we now have some time for Q&A, and thank you for those that have submitted their questions already. We've got a good few. So the first question we have is, what is the best way to signpost support to employees, such as the government's miscarriage certificate?
Good question. So there's been a lot of media attention on the miscarriage certificate. One thing I would say actually is when you're putting these policies in place, you're doing it on the basis that you want to help a lot of people that are going through all of this. But what you should also bear in mind, there will be people who want nothing to do with this. They have their own trauma that they're dealing with, don't want to be bombarded with lots of information about fertility. If they have come to the end of their IVF journey, if they have decided that they're not continuing, they can't get, they can't get pregnant for whatever reason and just don't want to deal with it. So, and that's something I probably hadn't appreciated. And then when we were sort of discussing about it at work, I put out an email to say, who would be interested in hearing about information relating to fertility? If you are interested, let me know, and I will put you on a dedicated email database so the people that didn't contact me don't get those emails. So so you're finding out in advance. But basically we want to try our best to help, but we want to try our best to not trigger people as well, because you don't want to inadvertently actually make things worse for other people. So so things like the government's miscarriage certificate, that might be something that you might want to say to your employees that are on this fertility list. Did you know that the government has this for this service available now, and send them the link. So you're sending it to those that are interested. Now, again, it may be that so I'm thinking now about people that have gone through it and just don't want to deal with it. I very often put these things in a box and don't want to deal with it. Like, sometimes in baby loss week, I just ignore it because I don't want to deal with it. But and that's fine too. But then other times I can deal with it. So so yeah. So just with that open culture, try and gauge who wants to have that information, and then just be able to deliver it to those that are interested.
Perfect, thank you. Had another question, or two actually, that are very similar. Would you recommend keeping your family forming policies separate? For example, one for surrogacy, one for adoption, and one for fertility treatment. And then someone has kind of along the same vein said, why have a separate policy, baby loss and fertility?
Yeah, so interesting, because I had a guest on my podcast who we were interviewing because she ended up having her family through adoption, and she works for cancer research. So I'm looking down because my dog's just woken up. And and she was basically like, well, they're trying to think about all these various policies to put in place. And ultimately, do you really need to have something that's so complex that you have to go, which one relates to me? So if you have something that is about family forming and you don't have to define it, but you set out what's available, that might work better for you in your workforce. So, on the one hand, we're saying, be inclusive, try and think about all the people that that may be impacted. But then at the same time, you don't want to be too wordy and make it too complex, so that people don't look at it. So have a think about what would work best for your company. It may be that you have just general fertility policy. And when I say fertility policy, I'm talking about the need to be out of the office for fertility related treatments and appointments. So so for example, when if you get pregnant naturally, that happens at home. You don't need to go outside of the office to get pregnant. But what you do need is time off your antenatal appointments. That is covered by law. So you have no problem saying, I'm now pregnant, I want to take my antenatal appointments. If you need to take time off for fertility appointments, So you want to, so you need to go for your egg collection, scans, blood tests. All of this stuff happens very sort of last minute whenever it relates to your period or your lining is. So that's when you really need flexibility. So you need to be able to, so I lost my train of thought. So yeah, so time, what are you doing? Oh, she's fallen out of her bed.
Going in.
Distracted. So yeah, so sit down, good girl. So think of, so you need, so anyone going through fertility treatment would be really helpful to know that they are entitled through your work policy that they can do that, because there's nothing government related. You can't say, I'm going to this fertility treatment, you have to pay me. And what you also want to know is that, so a lot of people that are going through fertility treatment don't necessarily want to tell their employers that they're doing that, because they're outing themselves as eventually wanting a baby and then therefore needing maternity leave. So as an employer, if you can be that progressive employer that says, actually, we understand that, 1 in 4 couples will need fertility treatment or whatever the statistic is, and that this is happening to so many people, we're not ignoring it, but actually we will allow you to go and have these appointments. So therefore, your employees will say, right, well, there's a policy for this. I'm protected. I can say to my line manager, I can say to the fertility officer, I've got to go and have my egg collection next week. Can I please work from home? Or can I have the day off as part of that policy? You empower your employees to be able to have those conversations with you, because they will be terrified to do it if you don't have that in place. So I'm a full advocate for having policies that you advertise to your staff, that they know where to get it. Anybody new coming in, tell them. Any interviewees, tell them. Women, men, women especially, who go to interviews, they're not going to ask you about your fertility policy and your maternity policy. They will be terrified to do that, for very obvious reasons. Even though it's against the law to discriminate, it happens. So, but if you can be the type of employer that says, these are our policies, without anyone having to ask them for it, I mean, you're setting yourself up better than lots of other companies. And if you're also advertising on your website and things like that to say we have these policies in place, you'll be attracting, and retaining a lot of good staff, I think.
Completely agree. I'm just very conscious of the time, so we are coming up to the hour. There's maybe time for just one more quick question, which is, would you recommend including pregnancy loss within a compassionate leave policy or keeping these separate?
Separate. That's an easy one, yeah, because pregnancy loss is, I mean, it's just very specific, isn't it? And compassionate leave can be anything. It could be, so sorry, eating her thing. I'm so sorry, she's just eating this. So I think keep it separate. It is that, and also don't keep it with things like maternity policies. When you're an employee looking to see what policies there are, you don't want to be rooting through things that you want but can't have at this point in time. So yeah, compassionate leave is a sort of a catch-all, and that's for anybody for whatever reason. But specific baby loss, you're acknowledging that this has a profound impact on you, and it's not, and it has a physical impact as well as a mental health one.
Perfect, thank you. So I think that's probably all we have time for with the Q&A. So sorry if I have missed any that have been submitted. I'm happy to answer those perhaps afterwards if need be. So just a quick thank you from me for everyone that's joined us today for our webinar on creating a supportive pregnancy loss policy. We really appreciate the sort of engagement and the support that you've given Natalie and myself today.
Yeah, thank you for all the hearts.
It's really lovely, actually. Thank you.
That's really sweet. Thank you.
It's very kind. So at Fertifa, we strongly believe that a well-crafted policy can make a huge difference to your employees, and can provide comfort, flexibility at what is really a difficult time. As I said, I have shared the policy template in the chat there. I believe you can download it on our website as well, and that's just basically to help you get started. it offers a framework to help you kind of build out that policy as it suits you, and what works for your company as well. If you want to know any more about the FATIFA resources, or want to explore how else we can support you or your organisation, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always more than happy for a chat, and to provide support for you. Thank you once again for being part of what is such an important conversation, such an important topic, and we really look forward to supporting you further in building that inclusive workplace. Lovely. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Please take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.